The morning I wired the final payment for my son's dream business, I was standing at the counter of a credit union wearing work boots and a sweater with a hole in the elbow. 5 years later, I stood outside the company's launch event holding an invitation that listed my name under guests, not founders. The woman at the door scanned the list, looked up, and said she was sorry, but this was for investors and team only. I did not correct her. I smiled, turned around, and walked back to my car. If I had said something right then, the 2 years that followed would have ended very differently. Not for me, for my son. 7 out of 10 family businesses never survive the first handover. They don't fail because the market turned. They fail because of a moment like a parking lot outside a launch event when a father decides to say nothing. My name is Marcus Webb. The business was my son Alex's dream, a packaging startup called EcoWrap. I put in $430,000. I didn't want ownership. I just wanted him to build something that mattered. But when I was turned away at the door, I started to understand something that would take 2 years of courtrooms and silence to fully reveal. That the deepest wounds in a family don't come from betrayal, they come from being unseen. I sat in my car in that parking lot with the engine off, the crumpled invitation on the passenger seat, and I retraced every step that had delivered me to that curb. The lot was full of people who had been invited inside to celebrate something I had paid to build. I could hear music from the venue, a DJ playing something young and loud, and I thought about how Alex used to sit at our kitchen table with cardboard samples spread everywhere, talking so fast I could barely follow. That was 7 years ago. He was 26 then, working out of a rented garage in Stockton, convinced he could replace every piece of plastic packaging on the planet with fiber made from rice husks. I didn't understand the science. I understood the fire in his voice. It was the same fire I had carried when I started my own company at 24, a small industrial supply distribution business I ran for 32 years before I sold it. I recognized the hunger. When Alex asked if I would invest, I didn't treat it like a gift. I told him I would put in seed capital in exchange for a minority stake, 49%. He kept 51%. I wanted him to own the majority. I wanted him to feel the weight and the pride of it. But I also wanted him to know I was there, not as a silent donor, but as someone with skin in the game. That was the first mistake I made. I assumed being on the cap table meant I had a seat at the table. The early months were good. Alex and I set up the company together, EcoWrap Industries LLC, registered in California on a Tuesday morning in April. I wired the first $120,000 that same week. We found a small manufacturing space in Modesto, signed a lease, bought equipment from a defunct paper mill in Oregon. I drove up there myself with a flatbed trailer and hauled back a hydraulic press that still had sawdust on it. Alex was grateful then. He called me his partner. He introduced me to the first 2 employees as my dad and my co-founder. I didn't correct him, even though I was only an investor on paper. That word, co-founder, it made me feel like this was something we were building together, something that would carry the Webb name into a generation I wouldn't live to see. And that mattered. It mattered more than I said out loud. Then Jenna arrived. She came in year 2, a marketing consultant Alex met at a clean tech conference in San Jose. She was sharp, polished, 31 years old with an MBA from a school whose name she dropped in the first 5 minutes of our introduction. She wore expensive sneakers and spoke in phrases like narrative architecture and brand equity stack. I didn't dislike her. I just didn't understand her, and she didn't understand me. She looked at my boots, my truck, the way I talked in plain sentences, and I could see her filing me into a category labeled old school. That was fine. I had been categorized before, but what I didn't see was how quickly she would become Alex's compass. Within 6 months, Jenna was not just a consultant. She was the girlfriend, then the live-in partner, then, without any conversation with me, the chief operating officer of EcoWrap. She started changing things, small things at first. The company logo I had helped Alex design, a green sprout inside a circle, was replaced with something sleek and abstract. The office I had been given in the Modesto facility, a desk near the production floor where I would come on Fridays to review orders, was turned into a creative suite for Jenna's team. My name disappeared from the company website. I asked Alex about it. He said it was a rebranding thing, that investors weren't usually listed publicly. I said I wasn't just an investor. He looked uncomfortable. He said he knew, Dad, he knew, but Jenna thought it would confuse the narrative if people saw a father-son ownership structure instead of a young founder story. I remember the word narrative landing in my stomach like a stone. I said I wasn't asking for a billboard. I just didn't want to be erased. Alex promised I wasn't. He promised it was temporary. That was year 3. By year 4, I was no longer invited to quarterly reviews. The financial reports I used to receive by email stopped arriving. When I called the accountant, a woman named Patricia who had been with us since the beginning, she said she had been instructed to send all investor communications through the new COO's office. She sounded nervous. I told her that was fine. I called Alex. He didn't answer. He texted back, "In a meeting, can we talk Sunday?" Sunday came. Alex showed up at my house alone, without Jenna, which was rare by then. He sat on my back porch and told me they were getting ready for a Series A round. A venture capital firm from San Francisco was interested. They wanted to put in $3 million, but there was a condition. The firm wanted a clean cap table. They wanted all existing investors to convert their equity into something cleaner, notes payable. Alex said it almost apologetically, like he was reading from a script. He said my $430,000 would be converted into a 10-year promissory note at 5% interest. I would get monthly payments. I would have no ownership. I would have no vote. I would just be a creditor. I asked him if he understood what he was asking me. He said it was just a restructuring, it was standard. I said it wasn't standard to push out the person who funded the whole launch. His jaw tightened. He said he wasn't pushing me out. He said Jenna and the investors thought it would make the company more attractive for acquisition later. He said I would still get my money back with interest. I told him I didn't invest to be a bank. I invested to be his partner. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad, the company is different now. It's bigger than just us." That was the sentence. Bigger than just us. I knew then that the son I had helped build this with was no longer the one making the decisions. Jenna was, and Jenna, I was now certain, had a plan that did not include me. I told Alex I would not sign the conversion agreement. He asked if I would at least think about it. I said I would think about it. He left. I sat on the porch until it was dark and the automatic light came on over the garage. I thought about my wife Elaine, who passed 6 years earlier and who had always told me, "Marcus, the hardest thing about giving is not expecting to be thanked, it's expecting to be remembered." I hadn't expected thanks. But I had expected to be remembered, and I was being forgotten on purpose. 2 months later, the invitation arrived. Heavy cream paper, gold lettering. EcoWrap invites you to celebrate our official launch and Series A closing. My name was on the envelope, handwritten by a calligrapher who had spelled it correctly, but inside there was no mention of my role, no founding investor, no early partner, just a line that said my attendance was welcomed as a guest of the founding team. I stared at that word, guest. I had built half the foundation of this company, and I was being invited like a neighbor to an open house. Something in me went still, not angry, still. The way a man goes still before he decides something irreversible. I decided I would go anyway. I would stand in that room and let them see me and make them explain, with their faces if not their words, why I had been reduced to a handshake and a glass of cheap champagne. I put on my best suit, the one I bought for Elaine's funeral, and I drove to the venue, a converted warehouse on the Oakland waterfront. The parking lot was full of Teslas and BMWs. I found a spot near the back. I walked to the entrance, handed my invitation to a woman with a clipboard who looked about 25. She scanned the list. She looked up. She said the words I already told you. "I'm sorry, this is for investors and team only." I said I was an investor. She checked the list again. She said my name was listed under guests, not investors, and the guest arrival wasn't for another hour. She was polite about it. That almost made it worse. I turned around, I walked back to my car, and as I sat there with the engine off, watching the lights inside that warehouse where my son was about to give a speech about his self-made company, I finally let myself feel the full shape of what was happening. I had been removed, systematically, quietly, legally removed from my own investment, and if I didn't act, the removal would become permanent. The music swelled inside. Someone cheered. I picked up my phone and called my son. He answered on the 4th ring, breathless. "Dad, where are you? We're about to start. I wanted you here for the toast." I said, "Am I on the list, Alex?" Silence. The kind of silence that is not confusion but confession. He said, "Dad, just come to the side entrance, I'll get you in." I said no. I told him I would not be snuck into a party for a company I had built. He started to say something, but I could hear Jenna's voice in the background, sharp and pulling him away. He said he had to go. I hung up. Then I scrolled through my contacts and found a name I hadn't called in 3 years. Franklin Cross, corporate litigator. He had handled the sale of my distribution business. He answered on the first ring. I told him everything in about 90 seconds. When I finished, there was a pause, and then Franklin asked me one question. Did you sign the conversion agreement? I said no. He said, then you still own 49% of that company, and I am going to make sure every single person in that building understands exactly what that means. The music was still playing. The door was still closed. But for the first time in 4 years, the door that mattered, the one that led back into my own life, had just swung wide open. Franklin Cross did not waste a single hour. The next morning, a messenger arrived at the EcoWrap office in Modesto with a certified letter. It was addressed to the managing members of the LLC, which on paper still included my son, Alexander Webb, and me. The letter stated in plain legal language that any attempt to dilute, convert, or otherwise transfer the 49% interest held by Marcus C. Webb without his express written consent would constitute a material breach of the operating agreement, trigger statutory protections under California Corporate Code, and open every signatory to personal liability. Franklin had also copied the letter to the venture capital firm Oak Point Ventures, whose general partner, a man named Lawrence Cole, had been negotiating the Series A. Franklin added a single sentence at the bottom. We look forward to receiving your confirmation of the above within 5 business days. That sentence was not a request. It was a flag planted in the ground. Jenna called Alex within the hour. I know because Alex called me, and his voice was one I had never heard from him before. It was the voice of a man caught between 2 loyalties, and neither one was comfortable. He asked me what I was doing. He said Jenna was furious, that the investors were rattled, that I was going to kill the whole round. I told him I was exercising my rights as an owner. He said, Dad, you're not an owner, you're an investor. There's a difference. I asked him to read me the first page of the operating agreement we signed together in my living room in April of the year he started EcoWrap. He was silent. I told him page 1, paragraph 3, membership interests. Marcus Webb, 49%. Alex Webb, 51%. I said, that's not an investor, son, that's a partner. He said the agreement had language about fiduciary duty to the company. I said yes, and fiduciary duty runs both ways. A majority owner cannot freeze out a minority owner because it's convenient. That is not business. That is theft dressed in a better suit. He said he would call me back. He didn't. Instead, 2 days later, I received a letter from a law firm in San Francisco, Brunswick and Hale, representing EcoWrap Industries LLC. The letter was 12 pages long. It argued that my ownership interest was subject to a buy-sell provision that had been triggered by an event of deadlock. It cited a clause I did not remember, buried deep in the back of the agreement under dissolution and transfer events, which stated that if the members were unable to agree on a material business decision for a period of 90 days, the majority could initiate a forced buyout of the minority interest at a valuation determined by an independent appraiser. The letter claimed that my refusal to consent to the Series A restructuring constituted a deadlock, and they were now invoking that clause. They proposed an appraiser. They gave me 30 days to respond. The valuation they estimated for my stake was $210,000, less than half of what I had put in. They called it fair market value based on the company's current position, which they had artfully described as pre-revenue with significant accumulated liabilities. I read the letter 3 times in my kitchen. I read it until the coffee went cold, and then I called Franklin and read it to him out loud. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, Marcus, they just made a very large mistake. He asked me if I had any memory of agreeing to a deadlock provision that would allow a forced buyout at an externally determined price. I said no. I said I remembered signing a standard operating agreement that Alex's first attorney had drafted, a friend of his from college. Franklin asked if I had kept a copy. I said I had a copy in a fire safe in my basement. He told me to pull it out. I went downstairs, opened the safe, and found the original document in a manila envelope labeled EcoWrap Formation Docs. I read the dissolution section. There was no deadlock clause. There was no buy-sell provision triggered by disagreement. What Brunswick and Hale had cited was language that did not exist in my copy of the agreement. Franklin asked me to scan it and send it over. I did. He called me back 10 minutes later. His voice was calm, but I could hear the edge in it. He said, "They amended the agreement without your knowledge." Let me tell you what that means. An operating agreement for an LLC is a living contract. It can be amended, but only with the consent of all members unless the original agreement specifies a lower threshold. In our case, any amendment required unanimous consent. 2 members, both must sign. My signature was not on any amendment. Franklin pulled the company's public filings with the California Secretary of State. The amendment was dated 18 months earlier, around the time Jenna was named COO. It had been filed with a signature page that bore what appeared to be my name, notarized by a notary public in San Francisco County. The notary's seal looked legitimate. The signature did not. Franklin asked me if I had ever been to a notary in San Francisco. I said no. I had not been to San Francisco in 6 years, not since Elaine and I went to see a play for her birthday. He said, "Then someone forged your signature and filed a document that strips you of the most basic protections you had." I remember the feeling that went through me. It was not rage. It was something colder and clearer. It was the feeling of a man who had been playing a game he didn't know had changed rules. I had thought this was about respect, about a daughter-in-law who didn't value me and a son who was too weak to push back. But this was not about respect. This was about law, about documents filed with the state. About a calculated, methodical plan to erase my ownership on paper, not just in the company culture, but in the legal reality. And if the forged amendment had not been challenged, it would have stood. The company could have forced me out. The Series A would have closed. I would have been a creditor with a promissory note that might never be honored if the company failed, which, without my oversight, it very well might have. The plan was airtight, except for one thing: I had kept the original. I asked Franklin what we could do. He said we could do several things, and none of them would be comfortable for my son. He said the forged signature constituted fraud. Filing the fraudulent document with the state constituted perjury and potentially forgery under California Penal Code. The notary who had stamped the signature could lose their commission and face criminal charges. Whoever had directed the notary and whoever had presented the false document could be looking at felonies. I asked Franklin if Alex could go to prison. There was a pause on the line. Franklin said that depended on what Alex knew and when he knew it. He said we had enough to file an emergency motion to invalidate the amendment and seek a temporary restraining order against any further corporate actions, including the Series A closing. He said we could also refer the matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation. I told him to hold off on the criminal referral. I wanted to talk to Alex first, not because I was soft, because I needed to look at my son and ask him one question to his face. Did you know? That weekend, I drove to Alex and Jenna's condo in Walnut Creek. I didn't call ahead. I parked on the street and walked up to the door. Jenna answered. She looked at me the way you look at a creditor you were hoping would stay quiet. She said Alex wasn't home. I said I would wait. She let me inside, and we sat across from each other in a living room decorated in shades of gray and white, like a catalog page that had never been touched. She offered me coffee. I declined. She folded her hands in her lap and said, "Marcus, I want you to know that none of this was personal." I almost laughed. I didn't. I said, "Jenna, someone filed a document with the state of California that had my forged signature on it. That is not personal, that is criminal." Her face didn't change, but her fingers tightened. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. She said the company's legal matters were handled by Brunswick and Hale, and perhaps I should speak with them. I said I already had. I said I had sent them a copy of the original operating agreement, the one without the deadlock clause. I told her my attorney was filing an emergency motion on Monday morning. She blinked. It was the only crack. Then the front door opened and Alex walked in. He saw Jenna and stopped moving. He looked like a man who had been dreading this moment for months and had finally run out of rooms to hide in. I stood up. I told him I needed to ask him something and I needed the truth. He nodded. I asked him if he knew about the forged amendment. He looked at the floor. He looked at Jenna. She said nothing. He said, "Dad, it wasn't supposed to go this way." That was not an answer. I asked again. Did he know? He said he knew that the legal team had made some adjustments to the governance structure to make things cleaner for the investors. He said he had been told it was routine. I asked him if he had seen a document with my signature on it. He said he had. I asked him if he thought I had signed it. He was quiet for a very long time, and then he said the words that broke something in me. He said, I didn't think about it. He didn't think about it. His father's name on a legal document, a document that changed the fundamental structure of a company I had built with him, and he did not think about it. He didn't check. He didn't call. He signed whatever they put in front of him and trusted Jenna and a law firm he had never met to handle the rest. And I realized in that moment that the erasure I had felt at the launch party, the humiliation at the door, the slow disappearance from the website and the emails, it was not a mistake. It was a feature. It was the natural result of a son who had stopped seeing his father as a partner and started seeing him as an inconvenience to be managed. I didn't yell. I stood up, walked to the door, and paused. I said, Monday morning, my attorney is going to ask a judge to freeze every asset this company has. If you want to talk before that happens, you have my number. I left. I drove home in the dark, and I did not turn on the radio. Monday came. Franklin filed the motion. The judge granted a temporary restraining order within 48 hours. EcoWrap was frozen. The Series A was suspended. The investors began pulling out. And then the story changed. Because the story always changes when the quiet man finally speaks. A reporter from the Bay Area Business Journal got hold of the court filing. She published a piece with the headline, Family-Owned Startup Faces Fraud Allegations as Father Sues Son. The article named me. It named Alex. It named Jenna. It quoted anonymous sources inside the company who said they had been told the founder's father was just a retired industrial supplier who had made a small loan and was now trying to extort his way back into the company. That narrative, the one Jenna had been spinning for years, was now public. I was the bitter old man, the greedy investor, the dead weight clinging to a rocket ship that had outgrown him, and the worst part was, Alex did not contradict it. He let the story stand. He let people believe that I was the problem. I sat in my house with the newspaper on the table and I felt something shift. Until that moment, I had been fighting for my legal rights, for the truth, for the principle that a man's word and a man's signature matter. But when I read that article, I understood that this was no longer about principle. This was about survival. If they won in the court of public opinion, they could afford to lose in a courtroom and still walk away clean. I was not just fighting a legal fraud. I was fighting a story. And stories are not won with motions and briefs, they are won with proof. I asked Franklin to subpoena every internal communication, every email, every text, every draft of every document that had touched the amendment process. We served Brunswick and Hale, we served Jenna, we served Alex, and then we waited. Discovery in civil litigation moves slowly until it doesn't. 2 weeks later, Franklin's office received the first batch of documents, thousands of pages. I went through them myself, night after night, at my kitchen table. I didn't trust a paralegal to see what I needed to see. This was my company, my son, my life. I would read every word. On the third night, I found it, an email thread from 18 months ago between Jenna and a junior associate at Brunswick and Hale. The subject line was Amendment Execution Strategy. The associate had written, "We'll need both members' signatures for a valid amendment. Do you anticipate any issue with Mr. Webb SR?" Jenna had replied, "He won't sign. He's not cooperative. Is there another way?" The associate had responded, "We can handle the execution on our end if you confirm you have authority to act on behalf of the company. We'll need a notary who can attest to his signature. I can recommend someone." Jenna had replied with one word, "Proceed." I sat at my kitchen table under the same yellow light that had burned above my breakfast for 30 years. I stared at the screen. I read it again. Jenna had not forged my signature herself. She had instructed a law firm to do it. She had told them I would not cooperate. She had asked if there was another way, and a lawyer and officer of the court had said yes. I forwarded the email to Franklin. He called me back in under 5 minutes. He said, "Marcus, this changes everything." He said the law firm was now facing sanction. The associate could be disbarred. Jenna could be charged with conspiracy to commit fraud. And Alex, if he knew about this email, was no longer just a passive participant. He was an accomplice. I thought about my son, the boy who used to sit at this table and draw pictures of machines that would save the planet. The young man who had hugged me when I wired the money and promised we would build something together. And now, somewhere in a box of documents I had not yet opened, there might be an email from him, a response, a single word that would tell me whether he had known all along. I opened the next folder. The files inside were sorted by date. I scrolled to the date of that email thread. And there, at the bottom of the chain, was a reply from Alex's email address. It was time-stamped 2 hours after Jenna's message. It was addressed to Jenna only. The Brunswick associate had been removed from the thread. Alex had written, "If this is what it takes to close the round, I don't want to know the details. Just make sure it doesn't blow back on us." I read those words until they stopped being words and became just shapes on a screen. He didn't want to know the details. He didn't sign the forgery. He didn't tell Jenna to stop. He didn't call me. He chose ignorance. And ignorance, in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of a father, is not innocence. It is a decision. I closed my laptop. I walked to the window and looked out at the oak tree in my front yard, the one Elaine and I planted the year we bought this house. It was still there. Still growing, and I made a decision of my own. I called Franklin and told him I was ready. I told him to file the criminal referral. I told him to name every person who had touched this fraud, including my son. The line was silent. Franklin said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure that the truth doesn't bend, not even for blood." He said he would file in the morning. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my chair in the living room and watched the light change from black to gray to gold. At 6:15 in the morning, my phone buzzed. It was Alex. I let it ring. It buzzed again. I answered. He was crying. He said, "Dad, they just told me about the criminal referral. You're going to destroy me. You're going to destroy everything." "For what? For a piece of paper?" I said. "No, for a signature that wasn't mine, for a lie that was told in my name." For a son who knew the lie and looked away. He was breathing hard. He said he would fix it. He said he would come to the house and we could work it out. I told him the time for working it out was 18 months ago, before a lawyer in San Francisco was told it was okay to trace my name onto a document. I told him I loved him, and that was why this hurt more than anything had ever hurt, and that was also why I could not stop. Because if I let him get away with this, he would never be the man I raised. He would be something else. Someone who learned that love means you can steal from the people who trust you and they will swallow it because they are your father. I would not teach him that lesson. I hung up. The morning sun came through the window. The oak tree was full of light, and my phone started buzzing again, this time with a call from a number I did not recognize. It was the district attorney's office. They wanted to schedule an interview. The interview with the district attorney lasted 4 hours. I sat in a room with gray carpet and fluorescent lights and told a woman named Assistant District Attorney Elena Ruiz everything I knew. She was thorough, patient, and completely unreadable. She asked about the signature. She asked about the email chain. She asked about the notary, a woman named Linda Shaw who had been operating a mobile notary service in the Bay Area for 12 years. By the time I left that room, I had given them enough to open a formal investigation. But what I didn't know yet was that the investigation would not stop at forgery. It was about to uncover something much larger, something that would pull back the curtain on a conspiracy that had been running beneath the surface of EcoRap for 2 full years. The first domino fell 3 weeks later. Linda Shaw, the notary, was subpoenaed. Under questioning by the DA's office, she admitted that she had never actually witnessed me sign anything. She said a woman matching Jenna's description had brought her a document with a signature already on it. She said the woman had told her the signer was elderly, homebound, and could not appear in person. She said she had been paid double her usual fee for the convenience. The DA's investigator asked if she had verified my identity. She had not. She had taken the woman at her word and stamped the document in her car in a parking garage on Market Street. She cried during the interview. She said she had done it dozens of times for good clients and no one had ever questioned it before. She lost her notary commission the following week, but the DA was not finished with her. They offered her immunity in exchange for testimony against the person who had brought her the document. She took the deal. She identified Jenna from a photo array in under 10 seconds. Jenna was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Her mugshot appeared on the local news by noon. The charge was felony forgery and conspiracy to commit fraud. She posted bail within hours, but the damage was catastrophic. Oak Point Ventures issued a statement that they were withdrawing from all negotiations pending the outcome of the investigation. 2 other investors who had been circling the deal vanished overnight. The company was frozen by the court order, and now it was also radioactive. No one wanted their brand attached to a startup whose COO had been arrested for forging the founder's father's signature. Alex called me that night, not to apologize, to beg. He said Jenna was facing years in prison. He said the company would collapse, that 37 employees would lose their jobs. He said I had made my point. He asked me to drop the charges. I said I could not drop criminal charges. Only the DA could do that. He knew that. What he was really asking was whether I would stop cooperating, whether I would let the case go cold for lack of my testimony. I told him I would not lie to a prosecutor. He said, "Even for me," I said, "especially not for you." Then came the discovery we had not expected. During the criminal investigation, the DA's office executed a search warrant on EcoWrap servers. They were looking for documents related to the forgery. What they found instead was a separate set of communications that no one had been looking for. Emails between Jenna and Lawrence Cole, the general partner at Oak Point Ventures, dating back 16 months. The emails revealed a side agreement, a secret arrangement. Oak Point had agreed to invest in EcoWrap on one condition, that the company's intellectual property, the patents Alex had filed for his rice husk fiber technology, be transferred into a separate holding company before the Series A closed. That holding company would be jointly owned by Oak Point and a shell entity that Jenna controlled. Alex's name was not on it. My name was not on it. The patents, the very soul of EcoWrap, were being quietly moved into a vehicle that would leave Alex as nothing more than a salaried employee of his own company. And Jenna, the woman he had trusted, had been negotiating the terms on her own behalf, with Lawrence Cole's assistance, for over a year. I read those emails in Franklin's office. He had obtained them through discovery in our civil suit, sharing the findings with the DA. We sat across a conference table, documents spread between us, and I felt something I had not felt since the day I stood outside the launch party. It was not satisfaction. It was the cold, sinking recognition that the betrayal was deeper than I had imagined. I had thought Jenna was trying to push me out. She was. But she was also trying to push Alex out. My son had been her co-conspirator in the erasure of his father, and she had been his co-conspirator in the erasure of himself. He just didn't know it yet. I asked Franklin if Alex had been shown these emails. He said not yet. The civil discovery rules protected certain documents until we chose to produce them. But the DA's office, he said, had no such constraint. They would likely confront Alex in their next round of interviews. I had a choice. I could let the DA reveal the emails to Alex on their timeline in an interrogation room with no preparation and no warning, or I could tell him myself. I decided I would tell him myself, not to protect him, because someone needed to look him in the eye when he learned the truth, and I was the only person left who might still tell him straight. I called him the next morning. We met at a diner on Clement Street, the same diner where I had eaten breakfast every Tuesday for 20 years. He arrived looking thinner than I remembered, his face drawn, dark circles under his eyes. He sat across from me and ordered coffee he didn't drink. I asked him how he was holding up. He said he wasn't sleeping. He said Jenna was talking about taking a plea deal. He said the criminal case was tearing everything apart. I listened. Then I slid a folder across the table and told him to open it. Inside were printed copies of the emails between Jenna and Lawrence Cole. I watched his face as he read them. First confusion, then disbelief, then a kind of hollow stillness that I recognized because I had felt it myself in my kitchen 3 nights earlier. He read the last email twice. It was from Jenna to Cole, dated 6 weeks before the forgery. She had written, "Alex won't agree to the IP transfer if he understands it. He's too sentimental about the tech. But once the restructuring is done and his father is out, he'll have no leverage. We'll present it as an investor requirement and he'll sign whatever we put in front of him. He always does." Alex set the paper down. He looked at me. He said, "She was going to take everything." I said yes. He said, "Including the patents." I said yes. He said, "And I helped her take you out first." I said yes. He put his head in his hands. He stayed that way for a long time. I didn't reach out. I didn't offer comfort. There was a version of me who would have the father who always fixed things, who always cleaned up the mess. But that father had been used as a tool of a fraud he didn't commit, and I needed Alex to sit in what he had allowed. And he finally looked up. His eyes were wet. He asked me what he was supposed to do now. I said he had 2 paths. He could keep lying, keep protecting Jenna, and let the criminal case grind him down alongside her until there was nothing left of EcoWrap or his reputation. Or he could tell the truth to the DA, all of it, about the forgery, about what he knew and when he knew it, about the secret IP deal he had just discovered, and let the consequences fall where they fell. I said the second path would probably cost him his marriage. It might cost him the company, but it was the only path that had any chance of making him whole, not legally whole. Something deeper. He asked if I would be there if he chose that path. I told him I was sitting in a diner with him at 9 in the morning on a Thursday, handing him documents that proved the woman he loved had planned to gut his life. Of course I would be there. That was never the question. The Alex Webb who walked out of that diner was not the same man who had walked in. Something in him had broken open. He called the DA's office that afternoon and requested a follow-up interview. He went in the next day without an attorney and told them everything. He admitted he had seen the forged signature and looked away. He admitted he had let Jenna manage communications he should have managed himself. He admitted he had prioritized the round closing over his father's rights. And then he handed over his own emails, the ones the DA didn't have yet, including correspondence with Brunswick and Hale that showed the law firm had knowingly drafted a document with a signature they knew was not mine. The associate who had recommended the notary was placed on administrative leave within a week. The firm itself was now facing a legal malpractice suit from its own insurer. The layers were peeling back, one after another, and what was underneath was not just one bad actor. It was a system of complicity that stretched from a condo in Walnut Creek to a law office in downtown San Francisco to a venture capital firm on Sand Hill Road. Then came the twist that no one saw coming. Lawrence Cole, under pressure from Oak Point's limited partners who were furious about the firm's exposure, turned over his own internal records. They showed that the IP transfer scheme had not originated with Jenna. It had originated with him. He had approached her 18 months earlier at a cleantech mixer and pitched the idea of a side vehicle that would own the patents. He had told her it was standard practice. He had offered her a 30% stake in the holding company as a finder's fee for delivering the technology. Jenna, ambitious and undervalued by Alex in ways I had never stopped to consider, had seen an exit for herself, a path out from under founder who, as Cole had put it in one email, lacked the killer instinct. She had not masterminded the betrayal. She had been recruited into it by a man who saw the cracks in our family and drove a wedge straight through them. Cole was not charged. The evidence against him was damning, but his lawyers negotiated an agreement that involved returning all rights to the patents and paying a 7-figure settlement to EcoWrap in exchange for a release. He resigned from Oak Point 6 months later. His career in venture capital was over, though he would never be poor. The system that had enabled him, the law firm, the notary, the culture of looking the other way, that system absorbed the damage and moved on. But the human cost was not so easily settled. The criminal case against Jenna proceeded. She eventually accepted a plea deal, one felony count of conspiracy to commit forgery, reduced to a misdemeanor with 3 years of probation, $100,000 in restitution to the company, and a permanent bar from serving as an officer of any California corporation. She and Alex separated before sentencing. She moved back to San Diego. I have not seen her since, and Alex, my son, was never charged. The DA determined that his cooperation and the ambiguity around his actual knowledge of the forgery made prosecution uncertain, but the legal clearance did not clear his conscience. The civil suit between us remained, even as the criminal case wound down. I could have dismissed it. Franklin advised me to settle. I didn't, not yet. Because there was one last thing I needed to understand. I needed to know why, not why Jenna did it. I understood ambition. I understood what it felt like to be underestimated. What I could not understand was how my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, to read a balance sheet, to look people in the eye when he shook their hand, had allowed his father's name to become a lie on a piece of paper. And I knew that if I didn't find that answer, if I let the civil suit dissolve into a settlement and a handshake, I would carry the question for the rest of my life. So I did something Franklin advised against. I asked Alex to come to my house alone and talk, not as parties to a lawsuit, as father and son. He came on a Sunday afternoon, the same day of the week we used to sit at this very table and go over his college applications. I made coffee. I set a cup in front of him, and I asked him simply, "Why didn't you call me?" He looked at his hands. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I have replayed every day since. He said, "Because I was ashamed." He said he had told Jenna in the early days that I was his co-founder, his partner, and she had looked at his old truck, my Walmart jeans, the way I talked without jargon, and she had said, "He doesn't look like a partner." And instead of defending me, Alex had felt embarrassed. Embarrassed of me, his father, the man who had driven to Oregon to haul back a hydraulic press. The man who had put $430,000 into a dream that was not his own. He had let a woman he barely knew make him feel ashamed of the most honorable man he would ever know. And from that shame, everything else had grown. The distance, the silence, the document he didn't question. Listened, I let him finish. And then I said the truest thing I have ever said to my son. I said, Alex, I have been broke, I have been tired, I have been overlooked in rooms where people with half my experience made 10 times my money. But I have never been ashamed, not once, not of this truck, not of these hands, not of the life I built. And the fact that you were, that is not my failure, that is yours, and you have to live with it. He didn't argue, he didn't defend, he nodded. And then something shifted in the room. The weight was still there, but it had a name now. And we could finally, after everything, begin to move it together. But the final reckoning was not yet over. There was one more door to open, one more person whose story had not been told. And what she had done would change everything I thought I knew about, who had really been protecting me all along. 3 days after my conversation with Alex, a woman named Diane called me. She said she had worked as the office manager at EcoWrap for the first 2 years before Jenna came in and cleaned house. She had been let go without warning, she said, but that was not why she was calling. She said my wife Elaine had given her something, a sealed envelope, about a month before she died. Elaine had told her, if anything ever happens to the company, if Marcus ever needs to know the truth, give him this. Diane had been holding it for 6 years. She had seen the news coverage of the lawsuit. She said it was time. We met the next morning at a coffee shop in Stockton. Diane was in her 60s, a kind face with steady eyes. She handed me a manila envelope, unopened, with my name written on it in Elaine's handwriting. I knew that handwriting the way I knew my own breath. I opened it slowly. Inside were 2 things, a letter and a copy of a trust document I had never seen before. The letter was short. Elaine had written it in the last weeks of her life, when the cancer had taken her voice but not her clarity. She wrote, Marcus, I know you. You believe in people until they prove you wrong. That is one of the reasons I love you. But Alex is young and money changes people, and I have seen what happens when a child's spouse sees an inheritance that is not yet theirs. So I did something without asking. I put the patents in a trust. The trust is irrevocable. You are the trustee. Alex is the beneficiary, but only after you pass or you consent in writing. Until then, the company licenses the technology from the trust. They can use it. They can sell product, but they cannot own it, and they cannot transfer it, not without you. I did this quietly through Howard's office, the year Alex filed the first patent. I never told you because I knew you would argue, you would say it was unnecessary, you would want to trust everyone. And I needed to be the one who built the fence. Forgive me for the secret. Forgive me for not being there to see how it all turned out. I trust you to handle the rest. Love, Elaine. I read the letter twice. Then I read the trust document. It was airtight. The patents that Jenna and Lawrence Cole had schemed to steal, the intellectual property that was the entire value of EcoWrap, had never actually belonged to the company. It belonged to a trust that could not be touched, not by a board vote, not by a majority owner, not by a slick law firm in San Francisco. Elaine had seen the vulnerability before I ever did. She had protected our family's legacy from a bed in a hospice room, with a pen in her hand and a mind that was sharper than any corporate lawyer I had ever met, and I had never known. I sat in that coffee shop with the letter in my hands and I wept, not for the lawsuit, not for the humiliation at the launch party, for the woman who had been my partner for 38 years, who had sat across from me at our kitchen table with her coffee and her opinions, who had planted an oak tree in our front yard and a legal fortress around our son's technology, and who had done it all without needing me to see it. She didn't care about credit. She cared about protection. And she had protected us both. I called Franklin. I told him about the trust. He was silent for a long moment, which was rare for Franklin. Then he said, "Your wife just made my job much easier." He drafted a new motion that morning, laying out the trust structure, and the fact that the IP transfer Jenna and Cole had attempted was void from the start. The patents were not EcoWrap's to give away. The side agreement was worthless. The criminal case against Jenna, which had already been settled, was not affected, but the civil landscape shifted completely. The leverage I had just gained was absolute. Without the patents, EcoWrap was just a name and a few office chairs, and I controlled the patents. Alex came to see me that weekend. I showed him the trust document. I showed him his mother's letter. He read it standing up, and when he finished, he sat down heavily on the couch and put his face in his hands. He said, she knew something like this could happen, and she never said a word. I said, that was your mother. He asked if I was angry that she had kept it from me. I said no. I said I had spent my whole life trying to be strong for this family, and she had known that sometimes being strong meant letting someone else carry the shield for a while. She had carried it beautifully. He looked at me, he said, what happens now? I told him the trust was irrevocable. The patents would remain in the trust. EcoWrap could continue to operate under the license, but the company would need to be restructured. I said I was willing to sit down with him and build a new operating agreement, one that recognized the trust as the licensor, gave him operational control, and gave me a seat on the board with veto power over any transfer of technology. I said I was not doing this to control him. I was doing it to make sure what happened could never happen again. He nodded. He said he thought that was fair. He asked if I would drop the civil suit. I said I would, once the new structure was in place and the court order was lifted. I asked him what he wanted to do with the company. He said something that surprised me. He said he didn't know if he still wanted the company. He said he had let it become something he did not recognize, something that had been built on a lie and a forged signature. He said he didn't know if he could stand in front of his employees and ask them to trust him after everything that had happened. I told him that was the first thing he had said in years that sounded like a real CEO. That genuine self-doubt, that recognition that he had failed and needed to earn back the right to lead, that was the foundation. Everything else was just operations. He asked if I would help him. I said I would, not as an investor, as his father. In the months that followed, the pieces of the settlement fell into place. The civil suit was dismissed with prejudice. The temporary restraining order was lifted, and EcoWrap resumed operations with a slimmed-down team and a new board that included me, Alex, and 2 independent directors we both trusted. The Series A round was dead, but a smaller impact fund in Oakland came in with a bridge round at a fair valuation, with full transparency about the trust structure and the family's controlling interest. The business survived. It even grew slowly, the way a tree grows after a fire, sending up new shoots from soil that had been burned clean. Jenna left California. Her probation terms required her to stay within the state, but she petitioned for a transfer to Arizona, where her sister lived. I did not object. I had no energy left for anger. What she did was wrong, but I had come to understand that she was not the architect. She was a person who had been handed a wedge by a man with more power and less conscience, and she had driven it into a crack that was already there. The crack between my son and me. That crack had existed long before Jenna. It was born in the moment Alex felt ashamed of his father, and I had not noticed. That failure was ours. 10 months after the lawsuit ended, Alex came to my house for Sunday dinner. He came alone because he was no longer married and because he said he wanted to get back to the habit of being a son. We ate at the kitchen table. The light came through the window the way it always did, the gold light that Elaine had loved. After dinner, we walked out to the front yard. The oak tree was in full leaf, the lower branches finally trimmed because I had remembered to call the arborist. I told Alex I had been meaning to do that for years. He smiled. He said, Mom would have been glad. I said, she probably already knew I would get around to it. She knew me better than I knew myself. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me something that had clearly been sitting with him. He asked if I had ever regretted investing in his company, given everything that followed. The fraud, the lawsuit, the years of silence. I thought about it. I told him the truth. I said I regretted the distance. I regretted that I had not told him from the beginning about the trust, had not been transparent the way I should have been. I regretted the pride that had made me want to be seen as a partner instead of just being one. But I did not regret the investment, not the $430,000, not the truck I drove to Oregon, not the faith I had placed in a young man who believed he could change the way the world packaged things. Because that faith, even when it was tested, even when it was broken in places, had been real. And what was real didn't become less real just because things got complicated. He asked if I trusted him now. I said I trusted him more than I had before, not because he had proven anything, but because the man who has never fallen does not know how to stand. He had fallen, he had been humbled, and he was still standing here in my front yard asking if his father trusted him. That took more strength than closing a deal. He hugged me. I put my hand on the back of his head the way I did when he was small. He stood there for a moment under the oak tree, and I thought about Elaine. I thought about the letter she had left. I thought about the trust that had held when everything else was falling apart. And I understood, finally, the full architecture of what she had built. She had not just protected the patents. She had protected the possibility of this moment. She had known that if everything collapsed, if the company fractured and the family with it, there would still be a foundation to stand on, a piece of paper. A legal truth, a fence, and on the other side of the collapse, if we survived it, we could rebuild. That was what love looked like when it was done carefully, not a burst of emotion, a structure. We went back inside. I put on coffee. We sat at the table, and I told Alex the story of how his mother and I had bought this house, the first property we ever owned, and how she had insisted on a fixed-rate mortgage even when the adjustable rate was cheaper, because she said she never wanted to be surprised. I told him about the winter of 1994 when I nearly lost my business, and she sat me down and said, "Marcus, we are not doing this." And she was right. I told him about the day she found out she was sick, and how she had spent the next 3 months not on herself, but on making sure everything was in order for us. The will, the trust, the documents. She had been building us a future even as her own was ending. Alex listened. He did not check his phone. He did not look away. He said, "I wish I had known her the way you did." I said, "You knew her the way she wanted you to, as a mother who was always there." She was also a strategist. She was also a fighter. Those roles were not separate. She was all of them at once. The evening came. Alex left for his apartment. I stood on the porch and watched his taillights disappear down the street. The neighborhood was quiet. The oak tree was a dark shape against the sky. I went inside and locked the door. I walked through the kitchen where my wife's voice still lived in the corners of the room, where the gold light came through the window at the same hour it always had. I turned off the lights one by one. I went upstairs. I set the manila envelope with Elaine's letter on the nightstand on my side of the bed. And I slept, not perfectly, not without weight, but soundly, the sleep of a man who had been blocked at the door and had finally found his way inside, not into a party, into something far more important, the truth. And the truth, when it finally arrives, has a way of unlocking every door that mattered all along. I have thought a lot about that moment outside the launch party, the woman at the door with the clipboard, the invitation that listed me as a guest in a company I had helped to build. And I have wondered, in the years since, how many other people are standing outside their own lives, holding an invitation to something they paid for but are not allowed to enter. The family business world is full of stories like mine. 7 out of 10 do not survive the first succession. They do not fail because the product was weak or the market turned. They fail because a conversation was not had, a boundary was not set, a signature was not verified, a son grew ashamed of a father who wore work boots instead of designer shoes. The numbers say that only 3% of family businesses make it to a 4th generation. I used to think that statistic was about money. I know now that it is about memory, about whether a family remembers who built what and why and for whom. What happened to me was not unique. It was a pattern. The pattern of the quiet investor, the ambitious newcomer, the child caught between loyalty and ambition, the legal documents signed without reading. The pattern of a man erased because his value was written in a language no one in the room bothered to learn. But what saved me was not the law. It was a woman who had died 6 years earlier, a woman who had seen the risk before it had a name, and who had built a fence around our family's work without asking permission. Elaine understood something that I am only now beginning to grasp fully, that love without structure is a wish, and structure without love is a cage. You need both. You need the trust document and the kitchen table. You need the lawyer and the Sunday dinner. You need to be seen, and you need to be protected even by the people who are not there to see you be protected. If you are watching this and you are in the middle of a family business, or you are thinking of starting one, or you are the son or daughter who feels the weight of parental expectation, I want you to ask yourself one question. Not do you love each other, but do you see each other? Really see. Not the role, not the title, not the money, but the person who crawled out from under the kitchen sink, or the young man who stayed up all night with cardboard samples, or the wife who sat across the table with her coffee and her stubbornness and her unspeakable courage. Because if you do not see each other, the gap between you will eventually be filled by someone who sees it as an opportunity, and that someone will not have your best interests at heart. The door I was blocked from was just a door. a warehouse in Oakland with loud music and a guest list that got my name wrong. But the door I eventually walked through, the one that led back to my son, back to the truth, back to a version of myself that could finally say what I should have said on day one, that door was always there. I just had to stop waiting for someone to open it. I had to turn the handle myself. And when I did, the woman at the door was no longer a stranger with a clipboard. She was my wife, in my memory, telling me that the foundation held. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever felt unseen or underestimated, or if you believe that the people who build things matter as much as the things they build, then subscribe. We are telling the stories that the boardrooms do not tell. The stories of inheritance and erasure, of trust and betrayal, of the quiet people who hold the keys to empires that no one knows they own. Thank you for watching. And if you are standing outside your own door right now, holding an invitation that gets your title wrong, maybe it is time to correct it. Not later, now.